Okay, so we're going to be looking here in the first of a three-part series on analytical essay writing, and we're going to start with decoding questions in the ATAR literature exam. So there are three key learnings for this. First, I want you to be able to identify the main verb in the question. Following that, I want you to be able to identify the key concepts, the syllabus concepts in the question, and then identify the discriminators, and I'll explain to you what they mean. So let's start with identifying the main verb of the question. And these are a selection of some of the key verbs. Now, if you Google SCARSA or SCSA exam keywords, you'll be able to quickly get the list of every STEM word that's used in exams. And these are the ones that I've seen that have predominated in the literature exam. And here's a bit of a numerical analysis of that. So if we look at discuss, that has appeared a lot over the last 6 years. In fact, if you go back to the previous stage 3 syllabus in 2013 and 14, every single question was a discuss question. But if we look in the past 2 years, you'll see 5 out of the 10 were discuss questions. And then the next most common are explain questions, and then you have examine questions. But don't ignore the ones down the bottom like argue, consider, and show. I wouldn't be surprised if in future exams we see a lot more variety in the words that we see there. But one of the things about this, though, is that if we look at discuss, explain, and examine, there's not a huge difference between them. All of them end up being some version of a discussion question. There are some subtleties in there, but it is important to consider that if you do get an argue question in particular, that requires a certain kind of response. That requires an actual argument for and or against a point of view. So it's important to note that. And then the next part is to identify the key concepts, the syllabus concepts that you'll see in the question. And here is the unit 1 to 4 syllabus for literature. All of this is examinable content. The year 11, unit 1 and 2 is examinable in year 12. I'm not going to go through all of this content now. That is what your study of literature is for. But the point here is that in the question, you'll need to identify the concept that's being engaged, and then be able to identify the discriminators. And this is where you stop and think. Now, what's a discriminator? A discriminator is a part of the question that enables the students who really know their stuff to be able to shine. It's there to prevent this. It's there to be able to stop you being able to regurgitate literary and cultural theory at the expense of engagement with literature. Too often in exams, some students get lost in psychoanalytical theory or Marxist theory or feminist theory while having a bit of a shallow understanding of that and not even talking about their text. Is to avoid students just treating quotes as proof, as if they're trying to beat a confession out of the question or out of the text, rather than a support for an argument. And most of all, this is about preventing memorized, premeditated responses. We know that a number of students will do that, and some students need to do that in order to get through the course. But the discriminators are there to allow the students with a thorough engagement with the text to be able to be separated from the rest. And those are the students that are able to make connections between texts and ideas, to synthesize the two. Those students who have an appreciation for the nuances of how texts are constructed, and those who have a critical understanding of how texts interact with culture. So let's do 2 worked examples here of what I'm talking about here. Here's a question from the 2017 paper. Explain how texts can capture points of cultural change with reference to at least one literary text you have studied. So, the main verb, explain. That means to show cause or effect, or to demonstrate a relationship. If we move on to identify the key concepts, well, points of cultural change is the key concept here. And that's the social and cultural context with a focus on change or shift in worldviews. So that's what I'm going to be thinking about there. And the key discriminator is this word capture. That's what will separate students. What is it about my text that bottles this moment, this point of cultural change, this point of the social or cultural context where there is a change or shift in worldviews? So what could I do with that? Well, one way I could approach this question is to write about the way The Great Gatsby captures the post-World War I zeitgeist of the lost generation through its character construction and its symbolism. I could look at how The Handmaid's Tale captures the backlash against second wave feminism and the rise of religious conservatism. Or I might write about the way Seamus Heaney negotiates the Troubles, capturing the difficult perspective of a nationalist who abhors terrorism. So those are three ways I could approach that. In all three, I'm looking at how those writers, or those texts rather, capture points of cultural change, points where there was shifts in worldviews. So here's another question where we can go through the same exercise, identifying the verb. So we're going to be discussing the way language has been used to give a voice to the marginalized in one or more literary texts. So if we're discussing, we're identifying issues, providing a point for and or against. That's from that Scarza glossary of definitions of these words. The key concepts here are interesting. One of them is voice. So in this we might consider this as authorial voice or persona, or we might consider it as the voice emerging through characters. This word marginalized, it's important. This is a syllabus concept again. So we're talking about social groups or people whose experiences are undervalued. And so what's the key discriminator here? The key discriminator here is actually language. This is where it says the way language has been used to give a voice. So here we have to focus on specific use of language and not get lost in other things like representation or character construction. This is about language. So what could I do with that? Well, one way is to write about the way Aboriginal people are given a voice through the use of Noongar language in No Sugar by Jack Davis. Alternatively, I could write about the way women are given a voice in Shakespeare's Othello, Romeo and Juliet, and Hamlet, because it does say one or more literary texts, but I've got to acknowledge that this is a mediated voice. These voices are mediated by a male writer in that context. If anything, that could make it more interesting, and I've done another video on decoding questions where I fleshed this one out a bit more for Hamlet. And you could write about the way women are given a voice in The Handmaid's Tale to challenge the marginalization of feminism in 1980s America. This is also a tricky one, and this is why these key discriminators are important, because we've got to talk about the way language is used to give women a voice here, and we've got to talk here about the voice of marginalized people. And who are the marginalized people? Am I going to be talking about the characters in the novel, in a dystopian fiction, or am I going to be talking about women outside of the novel in the context of the novel? Really interesting way we could, there's a lot of interesting stuff we could do with that. So, recap and revision. Be careful here. We've got to take care when we're decoding the question, because it is critical. It is the most important part of approaching your exam. Pick a question that allows you to activate the most clear insights from your studied texts, and make sure you exploit the discriminators. I have seen cases where students have just chosen the wrong question, or they've written a great essay to a different question on the exam. If all they had done was change the number at the top of the exam, they'd get a higher mark. But that's because they didn't carefully decode their question. So how can you go about some strategic revision? Grab a past paper, copy each question onto a blank page, a separate question per page, annotate the question, and identify approaches for those texts that you studied that might fit. And then seek feedback from your teacher on how you've decoded the question. Always seek feedback, and always do these things under time conditions and get the practice in. So I hope that's helped you with your skills of decoding questions, and in our next part we'll be looking at some advanced planning skills.